Hello friends, my name is Doug Batchelor. We'd like to welcome you to the first part in a series of new programs called Is Jesus Kosher for Jews? And the reason for that is because the three of us that are sitting here, myself, Doug Batchelor, Steve Wohlburg, Jeff Zaremski, all come from a Jewish background, but we've come to the place where we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so we thought we'd take some time in the next hour and be talking about what are some of the barriers that Christians see with reaching out to Judaism? What are some of the barriers that Jews feel regarding Christianity? And what are some of the biblical points of truth and things we might consider that are often misunderstood? We think there's a bridge, obviously. And now, I don't think that it requires me to deny or forsake my Jewish heritage to be a Christian. I don't know if you both feel that way also.
But it sounds like an oxymoron.
A Jewish Christian. Yeah.
To many people. On both sides, right? The Jews would think that's strange. The Christians could think that's strange.
Yeah. How do you feel?
Well, you're saying Jesus, and of course there's two pictures of Jesus, right? There is a Jewish Jesus, and there's a paganized Jesus. But the Jewish Jesus was a Jewish Christian in a sense, right? And so it shouldn't be... there shouldn't be anything wrong with that.
There's no conflict there.
There's no conflict.
Yeah. And what about you, Steve?
Well, first I want to say it's just great being here. I can't help but think of that classic line that when you get two Jews together, you get three opinions. So here we've got three Jews together. We'll probably have 5 opinions.
Or more.
When I was growing up as a Jewish person, I was extremely secular. You know, there's the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and to me, there's got to be another category because
Unorthodox.
Unorthodox, yeah, and so there really was no Jewish Christian struggle in my family. There was no debate in my family about that. When I first began to read the Bible as a 20-year-old coming out of a life of Hollywood and drugs and wild living and alcohol, my parents were more concerned that I was reading the Bible at all. When I was snorting coke, you know, that didn't really bother them so much. They really didn't know all
were your
the
parents
details.
Drug addicts too? Were you raised in
No.
a drug
Well,
scene?
my dad got involved in some things in Las Vegas and started taking pills at one point, but I wouldn't consider him. He was a businessman. He had a carpet company in Los Angeles. And my mother clung to her Jewishness, loved her Jewishness, appreciated her Jewishness.
So they raised you with the Jewish culture.
Yeah, but it was just culture. It wasn't, there was really no spirituality. And so in my mind, whether a person could be a believer in Jesus and still be Jewish, that wasn't an issue for me at all. Only later on did I discover that there was a conflict.
But that was an issue with your mom. When you started reading the Bible, that became an issue for her.
Well, yes, but not from a Jewish perspective. She wasn't concerned that I was reading and thinking about Jesus. She was just concerned that what was I doing? I was becoming religious. You know, I'm reading the Bible. What's this all about? You know, I'd go to the discos, and I would, in the 70s, you know, back in those days, and I did all the things that teenagers did back then. My family really wasn't concerned about me. But then when I picked up the book and began to read and said, hey, I need something in my life that I don't have, that's when the antennas went up, and what are you getting into? Maybe they thought I was moving into like a Jim Jones type of thing. I was going to drink Kool-Aid with cyanide in it. But from a Jewish perspective, they really weren't concerned that I was thinking about Jesus. They were concerned that I was just reading the Bible and becoming religious, and they didn't understand that.
And that's sort of how it was with me, is as I began to express an interest in Christianity, my mother actually said, why couldn't you get into like Zen or Buddhism or something? Did you have to be a Christian? And so I think we'd agree that there's a lot of Jews in North America, it might be 70%, that are they're very loyal to their Jewish heritage, but they're pretty secular in their beliefs. They don't, regularly read the Bible, or many don't pray, but they feel very patriotic about being Jewish. And there's some resistance to Christianity. Why is there this barrier to Christ in particular?
Jeff's a better one to answer that question.
Yeah, the like you say, it's interesting. They call it a Jew boo, right? You can have a Jewish Buddhist, and they have no problem with that. Or Jewish reading a crystal ball, or all kinds of things. They don't have any problem with those kind of things. Jewish Hindu,
Jewish atheist.
Jewish atheist, right?
Yeah, Jewish communist.
Jewish communist, right? None of that problem. It's a problem when it's a Jewish Christian. And so then we should wonder, well, why? And I don't think it's because of, again, the real Jesus, the Jewish Jesus, grew up. He never heard the name Jesus. His name was Yeshua, a Jewish word. His parents were Jewish. They 8th day bar mitzvah. Bris. 12, 13, they had bar mitzvah.
Now, brisk that's circumcision.
Correct.
Some people,
right.
don't understand that.
Right. So.
We did that to my son.
Yeah. He
cried and cried.
So he grew up that way, and the whole culture there was all Jewish. His parents were Jewish. I mean, everything was Jewish. And so it's what's happened later on. It's happened since then, the paganizing of Jesus, and then the Christians during the Dark Ages taking on this pagan Jesus, and then killing Jews and persecuting Jews. So when you have over 1,000 years of that going on, Jews today say, well, that can't be for us. That would be joining the traitors. That would be joining the ones who persecuted us in the pogroms and the Crusades and all the atrocities down through the ages.
I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that the word ghetto, they think the word ghetto comes from an inner city African-American community. But the ghetto was really a place in Italy. It was a town where the Jews were restricted to live. And so it became a metaphor for any ethnic group that was confined to a certain area where there was often poverty and problems. And so in Italy, they told the Jews, you can do business with us during the day, but the Catholics said, we don't want you mingling with us, and you have to live in your own place. And it was a town called ghetto.
Right.
And that's where the word comes from. It was a Jewish community.
That's very interesting. So it was the Christians of that day in that location that were imprisoning us in a sense in that way. And so when you have all that baggage, because again, in 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was there, a good percentage of Jewish people believed in him.
Yeah.
I mean, the majority of the country was. I mean, you think about it. For the political leaders to get worried about this one person going around, he must have had so many followers that the political leaders got really concerned about this and worked out his execution. I mean, could you imagine what percentage of the United States of an uprising would have to be before the president or Congress would start getting worried about some group that is growing so massively that they could take over the country?
Yeah, there was obviously so many Jews that believed in Jesus, they thought it was a threat to national security.
Right.
So when we talk about, and this is one of the common complaints that you hear, one of the common concerns is that Jews say, look, there have been all these waves of persecution through history against Jews from Christians as Christ killers. And while it is true that there were people in leadership that instigated his being handed over, it wasn't all of them.
No.
Because, they didn't even invite some of the Sanhedrin to the trial because they knew they would support Jesus.
It was in the middle of the night.
Yeah. And Nicodemus was not invited. Joseph of Arimathea was not invited. But there were wicked leaders that instigated it, but it wasn't all the people. And then after the Holy Spirit was poured out in Acts chapter 2, and it says 3,000 were baptized, well, it says there were dwelling in Jerusalem devout Jews from out of every nation. They were all Jews.
Yeah.
And then you go, I think it's Acts chapter 5, it says, and 5,000.
Plus women and children.
Were baptized, right. All Jews again. It wasn't until Acts chapter 10 they began to expand beyond just going to Jews. So almost entirely, the New Testament church was Jewish converts and proselytes that were coming in. And of course, the whole Bible, with the exception of a commentary in the Old Testament by Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel's book and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, the rest is written by Jews.
Right.
And so this anti-Jewish sentiment that you sometimes run into in some Christian churches still is really unfounded.
Right. Yeah, it could have been 25% of her estimate, 25% of Jewish people in that day believing in him. And it wasn't even it wasn't a new religion. So the converting, it was more of accepting him as the Messiah, receiving him because it was a Jewish sect. It wasn't a new religion.
It was an extension of what John the Baptist had been preaching, and he came from the Essenes.
Right.
And so, absolutely.
At least I believe. Yeah. So you had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, and now you had this next group, just another group within Judaism. It wasn't a separate religion.
Right. What are some of the common misconceptions people hear a person is a Jew, and what do they think?
Well, when I became a believer in Jesus, people asked me, why did you give up your being Jewish? You're not Jewish anymore. That's what they thought.
Right, right.
And I said, hey, I'm Jewish. I've always been Jewish. I'm still Jewish. I believe in Jesus as a Jewish Messiah. And
last I checked, I'm still circumcised.
yeah, that's right. And so is my son. And my
Still like
mother's Jewish,
bagels,
my
right?
dad's
Hasn't
Jewish.
changed.
And my brother's Jewish, my sister's Jewish. I have Jewish cousins, Jewish relatives. But it's sad that in my family, there just wasn't any spirituality. There wasn't any reading in the Bible. Years after I became a believer and started reading the Bible, one Friday night, I was at my mother's house in Palm Springs, and she wanted to go out to dinner with my Jewish cousin, Bob, and I wanted to keep the Sabbath. I'm a Sabbath keeper. And so on Friday night, I decided not to go out to the restaurant, and I just said, I'm just going to stay home, and I'll see you in a little bit. So when they came home at about 9 o'clock, I still remember my cousin, Bob, walking into the living room, and he looked at me, and there I was, reading Isaiah or Jeremiah or something, and he looked at me and he said, what are you reading? And I said, I'm reading the Bible. And he said, I still remember this was probably 10 years ago. He said, I really ought to read that book at least one time before I die.
Yeah, good point.
And I just thought, yeah, you should. And that's the culture of my family.
You mentioned your brother and sister. Now I remember seeing a picture of you at your brother's bar mitzvah.
Right.
So your family did have some.
Yes, it was. It was like we said, cultural, secular. Every year we would light the Hanukkah candles. We would have the Passover seders with friends in the neighborhood growing up in Studio City in the Hollywood Hills. And I still remember the empty chair for Elijah and the horseradish sauce, which I couldn't stomach, and the matzahs. And we would walk down a lot of times to Ventura Boulevard and go to Art's Deli and have the bagels. And there was a Jewish culture that I grew up in, but we never prayed, we never read anything in the Bible, either the Torah or what is called the Tanakh. We didn't read anything. And so there was just no spirituality at all. So when I was a teenager, I just got lost in the world of drugs, and I began to search. And that's when God began to make a move on my life.
See, that culture is strong, and so I think a lot of Jewish people are fearful that they're going to lose that culture.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I accept this Messiah, does that mean then, I cannot have my Judaism anymore, my cultural Judaism, what I grew up with, or what's familiar with me, or what's generational? Even if I didn't do it, even if we don't do it anymore, whatever, if people don't do it anymore, it's still generational. And then there's kind of like a subconscious, well, hey, if I accept this, does that mean I'm saying Grandpa and Grandma were wrong? And that then they're not...
It's like denying hundreds or thousands of years of history and heritage.
Right.
What happened to you, Jeff? What was a turning point for you?
A turning point for me, there were so many steps leading up to it, but I guess for right now, just give you, there was an emptiness and longing for some meaning. My mother found that in coming to the Messiah because she had some real needs, and it was a community service organization run by Seventh-day Adventists that met that need. And they shared the Bible with her, and so I hadn't read the Bible yet, and so I picked up the Bible to prove her wrong.
How old were you?
I was 18. Okay. Yeah, so
I was 20. So.
20, yeah. And so to prove her wrong.
I was 18.
You were 18
yeah.
too?
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like that's the year, 18 to 20. Cliff Goldstein, who's a friend of ours, I think he was. It was the same year, 1979.
It's a crucial time.
So that's
when we're thinking.
So you started reading.
I started reading the Bible to prove her wrong. I was working a lot. I was working about 70 to 80 hours a week. I was in college, taking full credits. I fell asleep during a test one time. I was so tired, but I had to help my mom. I had to get her out of this thing, which seemed so strange. Because I remember her telling us, she was in New York, I was in Florida, living with my grandmother and grandparents, my mother's side, real Yiddish mama. I learned Yiddish words from her. Handela, Fidela, Tushala, Stevala, Jefala, Dugala. That's it.
Oy vey was about the only word that I remember.
So she wrote to us, or called us, and told us what she was, that these people were helping out. This community service thing was very helpful to her. Okay, that's good. They were keeping Sabbath. Well, hey, that's great. They eat kosher like grandma, My grandmother kept a kosher home. 2 sets of dishes, miltika, fletika, 2 sponges for washing those dishes, 2 silverware, the whole deal. And so we said, okay, that's good. And they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So, uh-oh,
that's bad.
This is now really weird and strange. So I went to the synagogue with my grandmother. She was president of Hadassah, very active. So we went there and asked for, my mother was quoting the Bible to us. And so we asked for a Bible. I need to read the Bible to show her where she's wrong. And they didn't have any Bibles. They got the Haftorahs, they got the Pentateuch, they got the Torah. But they didn't have a Bible to give me. Mm-hmm. So I went and got a Bible. Actually, my uncle, years and years before, had moved to California. I remember I was young. The family heard that he had gotten involved with some Jews for Jesus type thing. Mm-hmm. He was a hippie. He was living on a commune in a tree house. And he got disenfranchised with the peace movement, the hippie peace movement, because it wasn't bringing peace. Mm-hmm. They were stealing from each other. They were fighting. There just wasn't inner peace. There was no peace. And one of the guys on the commune came to the Lord. And when my Uncle Michael saw that in him, it drew him. Mm-hmm. And then he ended up, and then some real rowdy, radical guy there gave his heart to the Lord also. And that was a turning point for my uncle. He said, wow, if you can change him, then this is real. And he really saw the peace and the harmony and the love, everything he was longing for.
So he started reading the Bible.
He started reading the Bible. And so he sent us all Bibles. Mm-hmm. I remember the whole family saying, he's Meshuggah, he's nuts, he's crazy, So my grandmother ended up with a Bible. We were little kids at that time and so we received children's Bibles. My parents didn't know what to do with it. You can't throw a Bible away, right? So they just put it on a shelf, but there was a whole discussion, and I used to read it. So then fast forward, I'm 18, I'm at my grandmother's house. We go digging out that Bible that Uncle Michael had sent her years and years before. And so I started reading that, and that's the Bible I read. And so I was reading through for months to find the text that says, Jesus is not the Jewish Messiah, he's not for the Jews, and then I'll just show her that, and I'm done, and I can go on with life, right? Yeah. And God started just changing my life, just reading the Bible. Because again, with that busy schedule, I'd say, well, I got to help my mom. I better read a little bit in the morning before I go to work. I got to find time somewhere, and I worked and then schooled. So before I go to bed, I'll read a little bit also. I fell asleep with the Bible in on my pillow at times, but I had to read it. And I told my mom, I'm reading this. I'm going to find you wrong. And she said, well,
What'd she say?
If you're going to read, you better pray. It's God's book, you better pray. So I'm reading and praying every morning and evening. Never had done that before in my life. And so I'm having these morning and evening devotions, but really, I didn't realize that's what it was.
So you hadn't been praying prior to that?
Not on a regular basis, no.
So at what point in your reading did things start to click? Did it happen all at once, or was it gradual?
No, it wasn't all at once. It was over several months, and more there were like little pieces that just were, everything was matching up with what she was saying. Mm-hmm. Now, if she had been, eating pork and desecrating the Sabbath or all, other kinds of, again, this paganized Jesus, I would have been able to say, there it is, right there. The Ten Commandments say you're wrong. You're following this paganized, wrong Messiah. But since she wasn't, everything she was saying was matching up.
Were you actually keeping the Sabbath at that time?
Not when I started reading.
Okay. So
my grandmother was.
Mom, she's keeping the Sabbath.
She was keeping the Sabbath, right? Yeah. And like I said, my grandmother was, and my grandmother went right on the Sabbath, went at the phone and stuff. But, so then I saw that, and saw where Moses says that a prophet like unto me is going to come. I was thinking, but whoever came after Moses that was like unto Moses, we have no one. I mean, David's pretty big, but not like unto Moses, so who is that then? And so I kept on looking in Proverbs. It talks about what is God's name and his son's name. Mm-hmm. It's like his son's name. God has a son, what is... So things were matching with what she was saying, and it wasn't finding. And so I started in Genesis. And so reading through, I was in Isaiah. So however long that takes to read a page in the morning, a page in the evening, or a little bit in the morning, evening, to get up to Isaiah, that's pretty far along. So that's months and months. Mm-hmm. And so my mind started changing, God changing my life. He gave me victory over lust. He gave me victory over drugs. And so he was changing my life. And so converting in that sense, converting from, just worldly to loving the Lord.
Yeah.
And I started then loving the Bible. I kept it with me every time. I took it to work with me. I started reading it every chance I could, praying then, not, okay, show me the text to prove my mom wrong, but praying for myself. So I was really having an experience with God.
Now, this is a whole Bible that's got a New Testament.
Yes, but I
So you
wasn't going to
haven't
read
gotten there
that.
yet.
I had no plans of reading that.
So what got you to Jesus, though?
I was driving along, there's this billboard, still there, 30 or more years in Newport Richie.
I read that in your story.
It says, Jesus is the Lord. And I remember driving, I saw it forever, you know, but at this point now, as I'm starting to think, wow, there's nothing here saying he's not, and is he? So I pulled over on the side of the road, started banging on the steering wheel. God, you got to show me whether this is right or wrong. Now it's for me, not just to help my mom. I need to know. So I finished those college courses, and I drove up to New York. I was going to go into college in upstate New York. And I stopped to visit my mom on the way and my fiance. And I went and visited my fiance, and she introduced me to her new boyfriend. And so that was devastating. And I went and stayed at a friend. I was going to stay with her, so that was done. And so I went and stayed with a friend. I couldn't do that for long, and I still had a couple weeks before college. I planned it that way because I was going to spend the time with her. And so now I'm homeless. I'm living in a park, and my mom takes me over to the community service place where she came to the Lord. And they were having a staff meeting, and everyone was sharing testimonies of what happened to them during the week. And I shared, well, my mom says that Jesus is the Messiah. I'm reading the Bible to see whether that's true or not. And the director told me later, they said, we go looking for people to share God's love with. And here, it's like a fish jumped into the boat. Yeah. He comes here and says, I'm looking to see. And there was a Jewish man who worked there, David Lawrence. And he showed me I was already in Isaiah. And so he took me to Isaiah 53, chapter 50, very powerful chapter. And said, read this. Who does that sound like to you?
Yeah.
And reading that, and again, I didn't know much about Jesus other than living in the United States and hearing.
What really spoke to you there? There it is.
I can't read that anymore. I don't. I need
You need your
Google glasses or something like that to tell me.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, here. You
I got my
wanna try
glasses.
mine?
I'll read it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was reading this morning.
Who has believed our
Yeah,
report?
right. Verse 1 says, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. There is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief.
You know, that where he's despised. You know, our families despised him, you know, and so that hit home. He wasn't this glorious king, Jesus. He was just someone who's despised.
All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
So here's this individual that he bears our griefs. He's wounded for our sake, and all of our iniquities are laid upon him. Isaiah says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. And that's just a small example of some of the Old Testament prophecies.
In that whole chapter.
Yeah.
Very clearly.
That's right. And
that's what I saw. I said, I can see what that is.
And, you know, it's interesting that some rabbis nowadays, they interpret this as a reference to Israel. Israel is the suffering servant. But when you really look at it, it says he is a man.
Right.
A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And when you keep on going, it says that he will make his soul as an offering for sin.
Right.
And it also says that he poured out his soul to death. He was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many.
But then it says he comes alive again.
Yeah, that's right. He will prolong his days, and he will make
So how can you
intercession.
know that? How can he die for it?
I was reading this morning, and it just it really spoke to me again, as the Bible spoke to me many times.
And then it ends with saying that we would then teach generations after that, and so it would continue for generations and generations. And so that prophecy was just so powerful to me. And he also showed me in Daniel 9 a time prophecy of when the Messiah would come.
It came right on time.
Right on time.
I read that too this morning, Daniel 9.
You know, unfortunately, many Jews, like my aunt and my uncle, they had a Bible in the house. And I said, oh, you've got a Bible here. And I was curious, is their Jewish Bible going to be different from mine? But it was an English translation. Right. It was the same.
Right.
And all these prophecies, and I said, you guys ever read this? And they said, no.
Yeah.
But they kind of looked at it as a good luck charm, and I thought if they would just open even the Torah and read the prophecies, knowing a little bit about the Jesus of the Bible, it's almost impossible not to recognize he's the Messiah.
Right.
You were going to read something in Daniel.
Yeah, in Daniel 9, I was reading this morning too, it talks about the Messiah, the Prince, in verse 25, and it says in verse 26 that the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And this is going to happen, it says, before the people of the Prince who is to come then shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, which was in 70 AD when Jerusalem and the temple was burned to the ground, and that's why there is no temple today over in Israel. There's just the Muslim mosque, the Dome on the Rock. But this is a prophecy in the book of Daniel that the Messiah, the Prince, would come and he would be cut off, not for himself, and then after that, the city and the temple would be destroyed. So you have a prophecy of a cut-off Messiah prior to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple.
Right.
And I mean, it's there. And there's other prophecies that I read. Let me find this one in Micah. If I can.
I've got a list here.
Sure.
I knew we were going to talk about this,
Sure.
but I've got a list here of about 44 prophecies. I've seen other lists where there's over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that point to what Jesus would do. But most Jews have never heard these, or they're misconstrued. Their idea of who Jesus is this stone figurine that is dead on a cross in the front of a church that was held up as the logo as they were persecuted through the ages. They've just got this convoluted idea of what Christianity is because it has been so badly misrepresented.
Right.
But if they read the Jewish prophecies about Jesus, the Messiah, who was going to come, and that used to, confuse me. The word Christ is the Greek way of saying anointed,
right.
Messiah. Messiah is the Hebrew word for the anointed. Jesus is the anointed, but and Jesus is the same name as Joshua, Yeshua. Mm-hmm. So we're just going back and forth between Greek and Hebrew.
Right.
But it's one.
And that
individual.
means salvation.
Yeah, God will
so
save.
it's throughout the scriptures. Isaiah talks about salvation shall come, and he's talking about him.
Yeah, and Jesus said, I've come to save them from their sins.
Right.
So you had another prophecy you were going to tell us?
Yeah, this is in Micah 5:2. It says, but you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. So here's a
Tells
clear...
exactly the town he'd be born in.
That's right,
Right.
Bethlehem. And I know you've been telling your story a little bit different than mine. You were trying to prove your mother wrong, and you got a hold of a Bible when you were 18. I picked up a Bible when I was 20, and when I was 14, I started smoking marijuana at the back of a school bus. Somebody offered me a joint, and I took it and took my first. Unlike Bill Clinton, I did inhale.
Yeah.
He said he didn't, and I did. And for the next 6 years, I smoked pot. Surrounded by Jewish culture and also the Hollywood culture, and very secular home, and just really no religion. And then I got into other things. They say marijuana is a gateway drug, and I started snorting coke and started using Quaaludes and various things and going to the discos and just living a wild life. And then when I was probably 19, I began to meet people in strange places who talked to me about God and said, you need to read the Bible. So you found that old Bible, or that Bible. And when I was 20 years old, my parents divorced when I was 16. My dad remarried a woman that was raised a Southern Baptist. And so I seem to recall that Anne, my dad's second wife, had a Bible in the bookshelf up above, across from their bedroom in the den. And so I searched up there and I found a Bible. I reached up and pulled it off the shelf for the first time, and I'd never read this book, and wasn't really, again, dealing with this from a Jewish perspective. I wasn't thinking I'm Jewish, I shouldn't even be doing this, because there wasn't enough, even enough Judaism in me to raise those issues. So I started reading, and the first book I ever read was Ecclesiastes. I was actually working in Hollywood at that time.
Written by Solomon.
Yeah, written by Solomon. I was an extra in the film business in 1979 in the summer, and I was traveling around working on location and in different studios, and I had free time in between takes, and so I grabbed my stepmother's Bible off the shelf, as a 20-year-old, still smoking pot and still snorting coke, and took it to these different studios, and I'd sit off stage and I decided to read. So I didn't know what to read. I'd never read the Bible, and I opened up the table of contents and I saw this funny name, Ecclesiastes. I thought, what is Ecclesiastes all about? So I began to read. I found it in the pages, and it was Solomon's testimony about how he had everything. He had all this money and all these women and wine and song and big mansion. And then he said it's all vanity chasing after the wind. Basically, he was saying, he was empty. He had everything, but he was empty. And at that time in my life, one of the songs I really liked was Mick Jagger's song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Yeah. Can't get no satisfaction, it's typical teenager. And so listening to rock and roll, going to the concerts. And I'm sitting there off stage reading that Solomon says, it's empty, I'm empty. And I began to look at the people that I worked with. I looked at the director and the camera crew and the different people, and I looked at their faces, and I saw that they didn't look happy. Here we are, we're in the movies, this is the glamorous life, but they just didn't look happy. And I looked down, and Solomon said, it's all empty, it's chasing after the wind. Mm-hmm. And I thought of Mick Jagger, I can't get no satisfaction. And I thought, that's me, that's my life. I mean, I have a Jewish background, but I don't know anything about God. I don't know anything about this book. And I have problems in my life, and I need help. Mm-hmm. And as I kept on reading, eventually I did get to the New Testament. And I didn't think, I shouldn't go there, because I didn't know. I just didn't know. And what really got me was, finally I read about the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26, about Jesus entering the garden.
In Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem, yeah, on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. I was there in 1983. I really wanted to see that garden, saw these old olive trees, and Jesus knelt down in the midst of the olive trees, and he got on his knees and he prayed, and he said, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Mm-hmm. And
the cup he was talking about, he knew he was going to
That's
die.
right. It was the cup of suffering, like Isaiah 53.
Isaiah 53.
It was the cup of sorrow. It was the cup of the sin of the world. Like Isaiah says, he would make his soul an offering for sin.
And that was at Passover. He just had the Passover, and one of the cups in Passover is the cup of judgment. Mm-hmm. And so let this cup pass from me, that I don't have to experience the death, the wrath of God.
And at that time, I was really, and I still am. My dad is, he lives in Los Angeles still. He still lives in Studio City. He's 86. I always remember that. 30 years apart. I'm 56. So it's easy for me to remember my dad's age. And when I read this in Matthew 26, where Jesus was in the garden, and it says he prayed, and he said, Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. Oh, my Father. And I have a close relationship with my father. And I thought about, here's a son with a father, and the son is praying, Father, I don't want to go through this. I don't want to suffer like this. If there's any way out of this, take me away from this moment. And then he said, your will be done. And really, that's what really touched me. And to me, the biggest miracle in my life was that in the midst of the darkness and just the delusion and the emptiness and everything else, the confusion, God reached into my heart, and he showed me that he loved me and that he was suffering, that this suffering, this messianic sufferer was suffering for me. And it drew me. It drew my heart, and it showed me, this is what I need. I need this. I need you. Yeah. And I got on my knees in a dormitory room, Cal State Northridge, 1979, and I prayed a prayer, and I said, God, if you want me, if you still want me, help me. Yeah. And I said, if Jesus is real, if he's really there, save me and get me out of this and forgive me.
So you saw a Messiah that you could relate to. Praying like that, crying out to his father.
That's right. Like my dad. I mean, I remember when I was 5 years old, my appendix broke. It ruptured. I had appendicitis. I was on a fishing trip with my dad, and it was critical back then. Medical technology wasn't as advanced as it is now, and my life was at stake. And they rushed me to the hospital. And I still remember, as a 5-year-old, I still remember this as a 5-year-old, holding on to my dad, holding on to his neck. And this strange man came through these double doors with this mask on, and he grabbed me and he wanted to pull me away from my dad to operate on me to save my life. And I remember screaming and holding onto my dad's neck, just saying, "Dad, I don't want to go, I don't want to go." And my dad still remembers that. He said that was one of the hardest things ever in his life, was to take his fingers and rip my little hands off of his neck and hand me to the stranger who was going to take me into another room to save my life. And I think, that's what was happening between the Father and the Son in Gethsemane.
The parallels, like
That's
Abraham
right.
and Isaac. Abraham takes his son, Isaac, to offer him as a sacrifice, and he's willing to sacrifice him.
It's John 3:16.
Yeah.
God so loved the world that he gave his son. We can't comprehend that love where you would give your son. And and this is what the Father did.
That's right. And Doug and Jeff, that's what reached me. Again, from a Jewish perspective, I didn't have any prejudice really against Jesus because I didn't know. And my family wasn't concerned that I was becoming a believer in Jesus. They were just concerned that I was reading the Bible. And when I read the Bible, I read Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and then I eventually got to the New Testament, and I read the Garden of Gethsemane, and I saw the Son and the Father suffering, and it reached me. And on my knees, first time on my knees, in a dormitory room, I prayed and asked him to come into my life. And I still remember this, when I prayed that prayer, this sense of peace just came into me. And this burden of guilt, the drugs, the alcohol, the promiscuity, and just the craziness of what I was doing, that all just lifted off of me. And I felt this sense of peace come into me that I'd never felt before, never. And
How long ago was that?
That was in 1979. It was in this.
And it's still there.
It was in the fall of 1979 when the summer ended when I left being an extra, and that's when I first started reading the Bible off stage when I read Ecclesiastes. And then just a couple months later, I went back to school, third year of college, in a dormitory room. I read about Gethsemane, and I got on my knees. Never been on my knees, and I still remember this when I felt that peace come into me. It was so amazing. I thought to myself, "Wow. This is better than drugs. This is better than cocaine.
That's
this
right.
is better than sesame and all the Hawaiian marijuana that I used to deal.
And it doesn't go away.
And yeah, and it's been 36 years, and I'm very happy, and my heart is fulfilled, and I know now that this is the book, this is the truth, and that Jesus is my Messiah.
Now, my story is similar. It's kind of between the two of yours, in that my family was antagonistic, my Jewish family, to Christianity. My mother was in show business. A lot of Jews are in Hollywood and show business. And my mother used to say a lot of outrageous things about Christians. And, I can't even say everything, but, she said Jesus was gay, and that's why all these guys were following him around, and that this was all written by men. It's been changed by men, and Christians are the problem with the world. They start all the wars, and
Some of that's true.
Yeah, well, that is true. Yeah, so I was very
The
jaded.
false again, the false.
Yeah, and once I began to become very dissatisfied with the drug, I was doing the hippie drug thing, and I ended up living in a cave in the mountains above Palm Springs, where I guess your mom was, at Tockwitz Canyon up in the hills there.
I know exactly where that is.
Yeah.
I've been up in those hills.
And at this point now, I was trying to find some purpose through all the Eastern religions. My parents were pretty much atheists or agnostic. My mother was very loyal about being Jewish. But, and I heard a lot from my grandparents about the Holocaust and their friends and family. And so they were very loyal about the heritage of being Jewish, but not about, they sent me to temple when I was a kid a few times. I learned a couple of prayers, and my mother got mad at my father, so she sent me to temple, and I just couldn't read backwards. I tried. So I wasn't bar mitzvahed. But I did not want to have anything to do with any biblical religion, Judaism or Christianity, because I thought all of them were hypocritical. So the Beatles were out then, and I thought, I'm going to get into the New Age, meditation, yoga, transcendental meditation, and Buddhism and Hinduism, and it was kind of a big yard sale of different religions. But when I moved in this cave, by then I was now trying to find God through nature, way up in these mountains. I'd go days without seeing anybody. Some people had camped in the cave before, and there were a few old pots and pans, and there was a Bible someone left up there.
And how old were you?
I was 16 when I first went up, but I didn't start reading it until I was like 17. I lived there a year and a half. And so I just wanted to, like you, I wanted to read the Bible so I could argue with Christians. Because I'd meet these, we called them Jesus freaks back then. They were hippies that had become Christians that were really bold and radical. We called them Jesus freaks. Because they seemed, we thought they were freaky.
Right.
You know, they were just like still half on LSD and sharing their faith at the same time. And they would come to me and say, do you know the Lord? Are you born again? Are you sanctified? And I felt ignorant because I really knew nothing about the Bible. I went to Catholic school for a little while. I know it seems strange, I was Jewish, but my father wasn't, so he would annoy my mother by sending me to Catholic school because they were divorced. And I read the Beatitudes there in Catholic school, and I heard some basics, but I knew nothing about the Bible. So I started reading it to disprove Christianity, and same thing that happened.
So there's kind of a
Just
parallel with the two
as
of
you
you.
read it, there's power in itself. You know, Jesus said, the words that I speak are spirit and life. And as I read it, I thought, wow, for one thing, I realized that I had been totally misinformed by everything from my parents to the rabbi that I had in temple. There were so many misconceptions about the Bible. It was like I was reading about a whole different religion I knew nothing about.
Right.
I learned more about my religion from reading the Old Testament than I'd ever learned growing up.
It's the same with me.
And I remember going to my grandmother and saying, I didn't know anything about this Exodus and how Jews became Jews and the
too,
call
same
of
thing.
Abraham. And I said, this is amazing religion. I said, we got a great heritage.
Yeah.
So I became very proud of being Jewish. But then I got to the New Testament and I had real problems. That I realized that Jesus really lived. And I had to, as C.S. Lewis said, I had to decide, was he a lunatic?
Liar, lunatic, or Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
And was he telling the truth? Was he crazy? And I just could not convince
And it has
myself.
to be one of
the three.
it has to.
Yeah, he can't just be
And did
good
you
news.
guys have the experience when you were reading through the Bible, you had these aha moments when you'd read one of these famous lines, like the handwriting on the wall, I thought, oh, that's from the
right.
Bible. I had no idea that was in the Bible. Or going the second mile, or turning the other cheek, or casting the first stone. And I kept reading through these sayings I'd always heard people quip. And I thought, I had no idea it was in the Bible.
Right.
Or that I had no idea my Jewish family was quoting Jesus when they said, don't cast the first stone. I thought, if they only knew all the times they were quoting Jesus.
Right.
And so I just became convinced he was not a liar, and that he was not crazy, which left the option that God came to earth in the form of a man to save, and he was a Jew. And
And that's an important point, that God came as a man. And like Steve said, when he was reading him praying and crying out to his Father, his humanity crying out, we don't believe in a man who became God.
Yeah.
No, that's New Age.
That's New Age,
That
right?
if we look inside, we discover we're all God.
Right. But a God who loved his creatures so much came to us, tabernacled with us. We see that in the imagery with Moses. Comes to live with us, wants to be with us, coming and walking with Adam and Eve. A God who wants to be with us, and so who comes to us and comes down to our level and puts aside for a time his divinity and becomes man. And so we have again this false Jesus where he's like this, floating on a halo type of a thing. But we see the real one was very Jewish, celebrated the Passover, cried out to his Father, prayed. And that's, very important aspect of our understanding of him.
And that's what the prophecy says that I read in Micah 5:2. It says, out of Bethlehem he would come, whose origins are
From
full
everlasting.
of everlasting. So you have an everlasting one who's coming into Bethlehem and being born as a baby.
Right.
So it's there.
And then
It's
in Isaiah
the
he
book.
dies, but his life is prolonged. And,
And you know what amazed me, guys, is that as I was reading the Bible, I was up there in the mountains at a lot of time, so I did a lot of reading. You guys are at least working and in college. I was just, I was not doing anything. I was really a hippie.
No texting, no cell phone.
No, I had
internet.
no television. I was a hermit. I had no electricity. But I'd
you in
read
the
the
book?
story of David. And
who lived in a cave.
yeah, that's right. And so did Elijah.
Yeah.
I'd read about that and say David wept over Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. And then I'd look in the New Testament. Jesus wept over Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives.
Right.
I'd read Moses stands on the mountain and stretches out his hands to intercede for the people. I see Jesus stretching out his hands on the cross. I read where Joseph's brothers betrayed him for the price of a slave and put him in a pit, but he came out alive. And Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12,
Right.
and they put him in the tomb, and he came out alive. And I began to see Jacob weeping for Joseph and the reuniting of the son and the father. And I started seeing the shadows of the story of Jesus in all the Old Testament. And it was amazing to me. Everything from the book of Ruth to the story of Esther.
It's
you kept seeing the
that
gospel in there.
It's amazing that your mind began to understand. And that's the same with me when I first started reading the Bible and went from Ecclesiastes and then Proverbs and then the New Testament, Gethsemane. To me, it was amazing that I started understanding. And I believe it was the Spirit of God that did that. This morning, as I was getting ready for this program, I was reading in the very beginning in the Bible, the very second sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
Right from the beginning.
Right, and then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And we've all experienced the same Spirit of God, hovering over our lives. When you were studying and I was reading in L.A. and you were in the cave, the miracle took place, and the Spirit of God began to shine light into our minds and into our hearts from the book. And Jewish people have at least we used to be referred to as the people of the book. But we don't read the book, and we need to read the book, and then if we do, things will happen.
Well, it's the spiritual things are spiritually understood, and so we do need to understand that with God's Spirit enlightening us. Because I remember when I first became a believer, this was it. The peace and the joy and the happiness and the love for others, and it's just amazing. And that's where you look like, a freak, because you just, I remember coming back from giving my heart to the Lord, and I said to my friends, "I love you." And they looked at me like, get away, but it was just powerful.
Love of God spills over.
Yeah. And so I just thought, well, hey, if everyone reads this book, this will do it. And so I telling people and giving Bibles away, and I came up to one of my friends and said, "You got to read the Bible." He said, "I already read it." And it obviously hadn't changed his life.
Yeah.
There
There has to be hunger there.
Yeah.
And there's a promise in Jeremiah that if you search for me with all your heart, you'll find me. And the Lord knew I was searching, you were searching, maybe for the wrong reason to start with, but you were open. And the Lord knows that if there's honest hearts that search, that he'll reveal himself. Now, we're going to run out of time in a moment, but I want to try and bring this circle around, is now you are involved in full-time ministry. Where do you live now, Steve?
I live in a little town called Priest River, Idaho, way up near the Canadian border with my wife, Kristen, and our 11-year-old son, Seth, and our daughter, Abby. She's 7. Great place to raise kids, and we have a ministry there called White Horse Media. We produce TV programs. I give seminars. I write books, trying to help people to understand
You've done a lot of
the book.
radio interviews and
Yes.
your programs are seen
And
all over
it's
the
a
world.
miracle. God has taken, just one quick text, Psalm 107 verse 20 says, "He sent His word and He healed them and He delivered them from their destructions." And that was me. Full of destructions, on a downward course, killing myself. And now 36 years later, I'm happily married with 2 kids and involved in full-time ministry, reading the Bible, and I am a happy camper.
Amen. How about you, Jeff?
And ministry is important, because just the Bible is important in all our stories, and many other people's stories as well. But also, we saw in our stories, people interacted with us and shared with us and loved us and ministered to us and shared God's word with us or in practical ways as well. And so people want to see it in the flesh too, in addition to in the word.
That's right.
And so it's good you're ministering. I minister, I serve a couple congregations. I live in Newport Richey, Florida, with my wife, and we try to reach out and demonstrate God's love in practical ways and through the Word of God. And so sharing, speaking, preaching, sharing books, distributing Bibles, and living it out.
Now, the one thing the 3 of us share in common, and I'm involved in ministry with Amazing Facts and have been 20 years with Amazing Facts, involved in ministry for 35 years now. But it's especially easy for me to continue to embrace my Jewish heritage, much to the consternation of some people, but I feel very comfortable because I'm not just a Christian, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. And being a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, you keep the Sabbath, you still respect the distinction between clean and unclean foods.
We don't eat pork.
Yeah, and you both are
right.
Seventh-day Adventist Christians. And I mention that because there are a lot of Jews out there, and one of the obstacles they have, they say it just would be so hard to worship in a Christian congregation that doesn't keep the Ten Commandments or remember the seventh-day Sabbath.
That's right.
And there's varying degrees of
That's where
dedication.
where they feel like they're betraying their roots and they're joining the enemy or joining a false religion. You know,
Yeah.
how can you give up the Sabbath?
And in the congregations I serve, we still also maintain the culture, the Jewish culture.
Mm-hmm.
So where some will do hymns and other types of things, we do the Psalms, and we'll do a Jewish liturgy and still maintaining the Jewish culture, Havdalah service and lighting of the Sabbath candles. Those are traditions, but it's still part of the culture. And there is a difference between traditions and the Bible, and we don't want to mix those two up. That's actually where some of the confusion has gone. Traditions has superseded in a lot of people's minds the Bible, and that's why a lot of Jews aren't reading the Bible, because we got our traditions.
Yeah, and Christians have many traditions that aren't
Sure.
biblical. They've just, it's
Right.
developed over time and
Right.
from their, whatever their Victorian denomination might be.
Yeah, so here
things
you
that
have
have grown in.
Judaism as a whole really doesn't believe in Jesus as their Messiah, and so there, you know, from my perspective, there's an emptiness there. And then if they look at Christianity, and they don't want that because it keeps Sunday and it eats pork, and so they don't know where to go, and so they get disillusioned.
Or because
so
the culture is so different.
Sure, and so they go off into anything and everything, and we're calling Jewish people to relook at the book, relook at their heritage, take a look at the scriptures, and do what most Jewish people, like my cousin Bob said. He said, I really ought to read that book at least one time in my life before I die.
Mm-hmm.
So if in the few minutes that remain, if you were going to make an appeal, it sounds like you started on one right there. If you were going to make an appeal to Jewish friends, whether they're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, and to experience the peace that you've found, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, to reconsider the book. This is really where it starts, to be a person of the book. And as I read that verse in Psalm 107:20, he sent his word and he healed them and he delivered them from their destructions. You know, we all, whether it's Jewish nature or Gentile nature, we all have a human nature. We all have problems with sin and struggles, and we all need help. We need help. And the great creator God, this is his book. And if we read his book and start there, like with you, little by little you began to change. Same thing with me, I began to change. In the cave, you began to change. Mm-hmm. So my appeal to our Jewish friends is to start here.
Yeah.
And then don't be afraid to go from the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament. Don't be afraid to check out the New Testament and to consider the claims of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, and to realize you don't have to stop being Jewish. You can become a completed Jew by receiving your own Messiah and finding the peace that this book says that he can give you.
That's well put. How about you, Jeff? What would you say?
You know, I agree. I think that's right on. The Word of God is real important. It needs to be the basis. And then, you know, for a lot of people, they don't even know if it's the Word of God. They're not convinced. We're saying it's the Word of God, but there are so many things. There's a powerful chapter, Psalm 22, that for me, it's the whole chapter. Just clearly describes this Jewish Messiah and his death. Very powerful. It even talks about his hands being pierced and his feet being pierced. And it's such an amazing book that how could David know that that's how the Messiah was going to die long before crucifixion was...
When he hung on the tree, he quoted that text.
He quoted that text right
from
from
the
Psalm
scriptures
22,
so well.
Yes.
Yep.
And so it's very powerful to see it, so I guess don't take our word for it, right? Read it for yourself, check it out for yourself.
3 Jews, 5 opinions.
Right, 5 opinions.
Check out the book.
Check out the book for itself.
Which is their own book.
Yes, and that's the
Yeah,
praying.
New and Old Testament, it's a Jewish book.
praying with sincerity, God, if this is real, show it to me. If it's not real, if you're not God, if there is no God, then show that to me. And if you are God, show that to me. My mom prayed that kind of prayer, for him to reveal himself. So there was prayer answers. So again, it's not just one thing. It's not just one Bible text that's the silver bullet or whatever type of thing. But it's the whole totality of it. A lot of horrible things have been done in the name of the Bible, in the name of Jesus, in the name of Christianity over the years. But also there's a tremendous amount of good that's been done.
Atheists don't build a lot of hospitals and orphanages.
Right, yeah. Or charitable.
Yeah.
And go around the world, and it's lasted this long, and the essence of it, and again, the peace and the true harmony that can be there. So the Word of God, living it out, praying with a sincere heart, asking God to reveal Himself if He's real, ask Him to reveal that He is real or not, one way or the other. But test Him.
Yeah, and to try to get over the hump of the way Christians have misrepresented Him, and to realize there's a separation between what the followers of Christ have done and from Jesus Himself. Take a look at the real Jesus right here, and then find out for yourself.
There's two Jesuses in the Old Testament. Now, the way you say Jesus, of course, is Yeshua. There's two Joshuas in the Old Testament.
Good point.
One was the general that brought them from the wilderness into the promised land.
After Moses,
Right. And the other was a high priest that brought them from Babylon into the promised land with Ezra and Nehemiah. And Jesus is our general. He is our king. He is our priest. And so that would be our appeal, is that people, I was looking at the statistics, and between Islam, Christianity, Judaism, that's the majority of the religion in the world. Most people in the world fall into one of those three categories. They're all based in this book. They interpret it differently, but really every Jew owes it to themselves to read this book and to let it speak to them for itself, because there's so many misinterpretations out there, and it can be understood. It's life-changing. So friends, as we wrap this segment up, we just think that it's important to realize that we got together just as three Christian brothers that are still Jewish, that believe that Jesus is kosher for Jews. And our appeal is that you find out for yourself. The Bible says, taste and see that the Lord is good. We'd like to encourage you to pray, because if what we're talking about is true, there is really nothing more important than discovering the truth. Jesus said the truth will set you free. And we'd like to encourage you to find that truth, to find that peace and the everlasting life that He offers. You owe it to yourself to read this book. So what do we have to say?
Shalom.
Shalom.